Now it is my very special pleasure to introduce tonight Stacy Levy. Stacy Levy is an artist who works with rain, rivers, tides, floods, and watersheds. Her projects give a home to rain to infiltrate from parking lots to nature centers. She also works to make visible how watersheds are the capillaries of the land, carrying precious rainwater from sky to the sea. She has created temporary and permanent works in Philadelphia, New York, Seattle, Phoenix, Batesville, Tampa, Miami, and San Antonio. She often collaborates with engineers, ecologists, landscape architects to make artworks that help solve simple site issues like storm water runoff and water pollution. Stacy graduated with a BA from Yale University and got her MFA from the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University. Go Owls! She began her work as an urban forester in the Mid-Atlantic region. Stacy has been awarded the Henry Meigs Environmental Leadership Award, the Penn Future Award for Women in Conservation, and a Pew Fellowship in the Arts. Everyone, wherever you are right now, please join me in welcoming Stacy Levy. Stacy, are you there?
Good, and start video. All right, here we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. And I hope no one's wearing pants.
Stacy, I know you wanted to start us off with a land acknowledgement.
Yes, I do. So I do want to acknowledge that I'm currently living on land stolen from the Susquehannock and the Shawnee, who were all displaced by European settlers back in the 1700s. We're mindful of a history of broken treaties and grateful for the opportunity to steward this land now for many, many species by managing the acreage for biodiversity where I'm living. I'm in the watershed of the Muddy Creek, which connects to Penns Creek, which then flows to the Susquehanna and into the Chesapeake Bay. We can all take a moment to think of where we are in our own watersheds so that you have a sense of when the rain falls on the ground, how does it get from your backyard to the ocean? It's good to know your watershed address. Thank you very much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. It's going to be a very interesting format, and I thank Matt for being extremely inventive and taking Zoom and really turning it around and making it something not so much talking heads.
Thank you, Stacy, for that very important land acknowledgement, and I appreciate you taking the time in that event for us today. Yes, so now, Stacy, I feel like we've been talking about this event, since like last January, and it's gone through a lot of different iterations. But what we're going to do tonight, what we landed on was a choose your own adventure style lecture. So what does this mean for everyone out there? For this event, we are going to use the poll feature of the Zoom webinar to put you all in the driver's seat and decide which type of questions you want to hear Stacy answer. This may sound complicated, but it's going to be very easy and really fun. So we're just going to dive right into this. Are you ready, Stacy?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, first of all right, so the first poll is coming right to you all here. All right, so you should see on your screen right now a poll window where you can vote which of these icebreakers should Stacy answer first. What routines get you going each morning? Or do you want to hear what books are you reading right now? Or do you want to hear what is your favorite type of tree? All fascinating icebreakers. And while you're all voting, I have a little primer question for Stacy, which is, Stacy, give us a little introduction. Tell us about where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in the Wissahickon in Mount Airy in Philadelphia. And I spent a lot of time in the woods there because it was right at the corner of my house, and it was a wonderful place to be. So I would sort of go off in the afternoon after school and spend time in the Wissahickon. I did a lot of riding in the Wissahickon too. And it was an amazing thing to grow up near a park, but also near a train station, a kind of perfect combination of green and transit that I wish more cities had.
Yeah. Wait, to clarify, what were you riding when you were out in the
Oh, a
trail?
horse.
Okay, good.
An SPCA pony, actually. A horse that had been picked up in on the second story of a house in South Philly, and it needed some companionship. And I wandered to the barn and became the sort of caretaker of that pony.
Well, hopefully we'll hear more about that pony. Here's our poll. I think everyone has voted. Let's end our poll and see who won here.
I would have figured that one on that one.
All
Everyone
right,
knows
yes.
what I eat for breakfast already. So.
So it looks like with 47% of the votes, what is your favorite type of tree, Stacy?
Well, that's an interesting question. Both Neil, my partner, and I are very into trees, as many people who know me are. And we almost named all our children after trees. My daughter was going to be Emma Lankier. We were going to call her Shadbush for short. And then my son was going to be named after the hickory, which is a sort of Neil and my shared favorite tree. But his whole name, if it had been translated into the scientific, would have been Carrie Emanuel, and that seemed like a silly sentence, so we didn't name them that. None of them got tree names. But my actual favorite tree is the American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis. And the reason that I'm very into them is because they grow along stream banks. And so in the winter, and you can do this as you're driving on 76 on the Schuylkill Expressway around Gwynedd, around the curve there, Conshohocken curve, you can see these white stems of the very white barked American sycamore growing along the stream bank and tracing the stream bank, the stream's meanders, with this kind of ghostly white structure. And I love this idea that there are these ghost maps. Sometimes when you're flying over a winter landscape, you can see these same ghost maps of the sycamore trees growing along the tributaries, and they're mapping it in a third dimension. So I'm quite into the American sycamore. Great for climbing too.
American sycamore, that's a fantastic answer. I think, if you are interested, I would love to hear our audiences what your favorite types of trees are in the chat. Now, follow-up question.
Better all be natives. Yeah. No
you think
doorway.
Your children are happy that they're not named after trees?
I think so.
Great. All right, here, we're going to get moving right along. We're going to start our next poll. All right. Our next poll question is, which of these mini lectures do you want to hear Stacy talk about? We've got two options here. A mini lecture called Things That Decay, interesting, or Tides and the Moon. Things That Decay or Tides and the Moon. Tell us what you think, everyone. In the meantime, I want to hear Stacy talk about, how do you see art and science working together?
Oh, that's a real hot button topic with me, because I really wanted to be a scientist when I was younger, but I just didn't have the mind for it. So I've always been very interested in how art and science can come together. And I think artists and scientists are very kindred spirits in many ways, with curiosity and wanting to figure out how the world works. It's just that artists don't need the same kind of solid answers that scientists have. Now, one thing science does not have going for it is it cannot tell its own story. It's a crappy storyteller. As we can see, why creationist stories just go way ahead in the polls, because they're so much better in terms of stories, and the way science expresses itself in graphs and charts and equations is a rarefied language that a lot of people don't understand, and doesn't get into the hearts of different modalities of learning. If you're a kinetic learner or you're a visual learner, science is going to kind of shed right off you. So I feel that art really needs to team up with scientists to help explain how the world works, so that people have a better sense of what's going on in the world. Why is nature doing this, and why is it not doing this other thing? To get a grip on the processes and patterns in nature, I think that scientists really should look to artists to help tell their story. And I'm hoping that that's going to happen more and more in the future.
Yeah, that's such a great point, that the scientists need artists as their storytellers. And I think that's a really profound and important part of that, if we really want the scientists to have an impact And I encourage, if you haven't seen the show, to come see the Rising Tide show, because there is a lot of storytelling in that exhibition. All right, everyone, you've had enough chance to vote. Let's see what our results are.
Tides in the moon. I would have thought it was Decay. Anyone can stay afterwards. I'll do Decay.
Tides and the moon. All right, Stacy.
So I have to slide. I'm going to slide down to where that lecture. These are like little sort of mini series lectures. And oops, that didn't go where I wanted it to go. And now, Matt, I'm not sharing screen, so I have to hit share screen, right?
Yes.
All right. It'll just be a second. And here we go. And here we
some
go.
People had some great responses for their favorite tree here. The
Eastern
redbud
slideshow. Okay. Oh, whoops.
The Koya tree.
Yeah, let's see what
tulip popular.
I'm gonna just shut this. I'm gonna shut this, and we have to let's see, this didn't set this right way, so we have to just go very quickly to see what Decay was all about, because system has not been perfected. Okay, haha, there we go, double blanks. Okay, tides in the moon. I'm really into tides. Not that I'm a big ocean person. I really prefer a lake, but what I'm into are urban tides. I love when urban rivers have a tide, and I grew up in Philadelphia, right on the Schuylkill, drinking the Schuylkill. I had no idea that there was a tide in the lower part of the Schuylkill, below the art museum, below the dam. And when I found that out, I've been kind of wanting to point it out and to make it visible ever since. But there's something really interesting about, you always think that the tide and the moon have a kind of collaborative effect. And I've always wondered exactly, how does the moon affect the tide? On the East Coast, we have, whoops, a typo there, whoa, times a day. We have a tide that's 2 times a day.
Here.
Can you see it?
No, I can't see it. So let's see if you can try to share screen again.
Shared screen. Okay, wait, let me escape. Okay, let me just double check that we're sharing screen. And okay, are you seeing it now?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, and we did practice this, but it's Zoom always changes its mind in the middle. So, okay, so I'm going to go with this, and I'm going to go into slide view. Slideshow. Okay. Oh, I have to go zipping through it. It doesn't want to do it as quickly as I want to do it. You're getting another tour of Decay. This is Decay. These are actually really fun to do, because normally I have to, talk about. There we go. Okay, two blanks. And so there, tides in the moon. Okay, so does the moon have an effect on the tide? Yes, it does. And it's a kind of unexpected one, because the sun also has an effect. We'll see that. We have the tide 2 times a day. There's my typo. It's high and low twice a day. It's in a 23-hour period, which is why the tide shifts slightly. It's at 9 o'clock every single morning. It's not the same tide. It's on a lunar calendar, a lunar time clock. And so the tide sort of slips through our 24-hour day in a very interesting way. The rising tide is referred to as the flood tide. The lowering tide is the ebb tide. And this place in between is half tide. In Philadelphia on the Schuylkill, it's a 6-foot tidal range between high tide and low tide, which is pretty substantial. So is the moon affecting the tide? A little bit every day, but how it's really affecting the tide is when the moon is in a different position in relationship with the earth and the sun. That's when it has a different gravitational pull. Both of those celestial bodies, the sun and the moon, are actually very active in creating the tide. But when the moon is full or new, it's lined up in a way that has a stronger pull, and you get a more extreme tide. And when the moon is in the quarter, either the first quarter or the last quarter, you get the least amount of tide, the least range. So these extreme high tides, these high tides and low tides happen twice a month. They happen on the full moon and the new moon because of the position. And the lesser tides happen twice a month too with the quarter moon. A very high tide is called a spring tide, and a very low tide is called a neap tide. Okay, the neap tide is the one that's not very extreme. So here is a typical tide chart too, and you can see it's a little subtle because there's a full 6 to 7 feet when the tides are at full and new moon. You can see the yellow orb. And you can see on the other side, if my face isn't there, there's a new moon on the other side. That tide, the height of the tide and the lowness of the tide are a full foot higher or lower during those spring tides, which happen at the full and the new moon. That's quite a bit of tidal change. I mean, we talk about sea change being a number of inches sea level rise. When the tide goes up an extra foot, it's really a lot, and you get all sorts of, that's when you get this sort of situation where the park bench and the whole shoreline can get covered, particularly in if it's a flooded period. So the spring tide happens when the moon is new or it's full. It happens with both of those times because the moon is aligned with the sun. You can see how the moon is, with a new moon, it's parallel with the sun, and you get this bigger pull. The tidal bulge is pulled out. It's interesting to see spring tide. A lot of people think, oh, it happens in the spring because of spring tide, but it's actually from the old German springen, which means to rise up. And then when there's a quarter, you can see how the moon is sort of perpendicular to the sun. And the neap tide, this lesser tide, happens when the gravitational force of the moon and the gravitational force of the sun are not lined up. They're not in a nice parallel lineup. And neap is from the Old English meaning scant or lacking. So spring tides, these very, very high and very, very low tides, happen on the new and the full moon. The tides being pulled in the same direction by these combined gravitational forces. So it's interesting to think that when the sun and the moon work in consort, when they collaborate, you get a bigger tide. But when they're working in opposition to each other and they're doing a sort of perpendicular, you can say the perpendicular blue bar, when the moon is sort of not working with the sun, you get the neap tide, the lesser tides. So it's interesting that collaboration gives a bigger tidal bulge, and that's a way of thinking about it. Like seeing the tides, knowing about the moon is tricky, because when you look at the moon in the sky, unless you have looked at your moon calendar recently, it's very hard to know if the moon is waxing or waning. Is it getting larger or is it shrinking? And I worked out a methodology for figuring this out. If the arc of the moon is like the curve of a pea, it means it's plumping or it's waxing, it's growing. But if it's the curve of a C, it means it's composting or shrinking and waning. I did want to do this with a D, but if you think about a D faces 2 different directions depending on whether it's a capital or a lowercase. So that didn't work. So I had to go with a C. So you can see these moons in this, this is part of a Bartram's River Rooms. The C shape in the bottom means this moon that I'm showing below is composting or waning towards a new moon. And with moons and that kind of hard to register which way they're going, the same thing is true with tides, particularly with urban tides that are very hard to mark in the channels that the cities create for these urban rivers to be in. So I'm often making projects that are trying to visually express where the tide is at any given time, a registration of the tide. This is the high tide on the Hudson River. This is a prototype for a project. And it's blooms at high tide, and then it closes the blossoms at low tide. The Hudson River is a 4-foot tide, so these petals are 4 feet long. I did want to try one, so I prototyped this on the Schuylkill, which has a 6-foot tide, so these petals are 6 feet long. And it was the currents are really tricky here. And this one just didn't work. And I tried a number of other prototypes. It's funny, you rarely get to see an artist thinking their way through a situation. So I'm giving you a little chance to see me working with the tides. So I'm trying to figure out, how can I visualize this slow, steady movement of the tide? that happens twice a day. So that was at low tide earlier. Now we're at high tide. These kind of algae-like forms are floating, but we decided against that. But we did end up with this tide field piece, which were strands of buoys that could show the river tide, something that really most people don't remember, and they don't remember to look for, and it's just very hard to register. You can see the wet line as the tide's going down, but the wet line is erased as the tide goes up, so you lose track of a rising tide. So with tide fields, the diagram is that the buoys would take these 3 different forms depending on the tide, and that's how you would know. High tide and half tide and low tide, you get the sort of the I or the C or J shape, and then the line flat caterpillar for low tide. So here we are at high tide on the Schuylkill. They're all you're just seeing the top 3 buoys out of the 9. And then the tide is going down. It's going down 3 feet to become half tide. And you get these arcing kind of caterpillar shapes. And then when it's low tide, it's dropped a full 6 feet. You get these kind of sleepy caterpillars hanging out on the river. It was nice too, because they also showed the current. They would face different directions depending if the tide was going in or going out. So that was an added extra. And you could actually register if the tide was going up or down, because if you looked, you could see if buoys were disappearing into the water, submerging in the water, or becoming more apparent, coming out of the water. So you could watch these from these river rooms that were created for this project too. So it was a way of getting a sense of the tide. And we also did a couple projects where we were marking the tide in real time at Bartram's Gardens. So we would go, and every hour we would show where the tide was. And people would chalk in to kind of create this tide chart, and we're tracking that ebbing and flowing of the tide that's happening, just about 20 feet to the downslope side of us here. So it's a really good way to get a sense of the tides timetable. And I think it's really important to learn about the tides, because we're so threatened with climate crisis and the idea that our waters are all rising, that if we just feel fear about it instead of knowing and then embracing these processes, we're not going to come up with good answers. But if we embrace the idea of a tide and that it's sort of the river breathing in and out, then we really have something to work with and something to try and figure out a solution of how we can live with that. You can see that tide spans, it takes 6 hours to get from low tide to get back to high tide. And there was actually 6 hours of real time, which is actually more like, it was like 9 hours of real time while we were drawing this all day down at Bartram's Gardens. So you could see this ebbing and flowing 1 foot an hour. It's moving up a foot every hour, and it's moving down a foot every hour. It's a wonderful timepiece in our lives that we just simply don't know about. Sort of like we have a clock with no hands if you don't see how the tide is working. So here, a little forensics here. This is another prototype for tide flowers, and you can see how these blossoms are sort of poked up a little, almost like a lily. So this was probably taken during a full moon or a new moon, because it's a spring tide. It's an extra high tide that I can't quite calibrate for. My pieces have to be flexible enough to make it. Okay, and here's your quiz. Is this moon here waxing or waning? And if you had paid attention, you would know that that P-shaped arc is a plumping or a waxing moon. So so that we're moving to the quarter, and this will be heading towards a full moon in 2 weeks' time. So that's all about getting to know the invisible tide and the sort of less visible progress of the moon. All right, good.
Wow. What a special treat, a mini lecture. All right, folks, we're ready to move on now. All right, we have our next poll. Let's see here, poll number 3. Which of these and other mini lectures do you want to hear about? Do you want to hear all about clouds or rain and flooding? All about clouds or rain and flooding? While we wait for those responses, I want to know, Stacy, you have a lot of influences on your practice and your work. What are some of the weirdest influences that have impacted your work?
I used to have a big hound dog named Schuylkill, and It was back when I was a forester. I was working with my friend and cohort and partner in crime, Adam Cubey, and we shared a studio where I went on rainy days and on the weekends. And I, at that point, was making a lot of like seed potty and burr-like things out of plasticine and tubing. And I was replicating these patterns of nature. They were all laid out on a bench drying. And I took my big dog, because he whined so much if I left him at home. I took him to the studio and he walked past this bench a little too close, and all of these burry kind of seed pods stuck to his coat. So they went from being like precious artworks to being actual active burrs. And after I got over the initial shock of like, oh my God, all my stuff's going to be on the floor and I'm going to have to repair it, it gave me a sense, one of those aha moments, that what was far more interesting was the burrs acting like burrs, that they were doing a verb. They were actually doing something. There was a process going on. They had hairy, sticky parts and they stuck to a furry coat. And that was far more interesting than the kind of static noun of me just replicating a seed pod. And that's when I started to see that process is probably the path I wanted to go down instead of making objects. And so I've been really working hard to try and make my work more about being a verb and not so much about being a noun.
Oh, I love that metaphor, a verb instead of a noun. I love that.
Well,
That's
not
great.
so art worldy, but
No, I think it's perfect. All right, it was neck and neck here.
Oh my gosh.
By one vote.
Ooh, I don't, that
Rain
was
and flooding.
those numbers, those ratios are too close to a bad memory. Okay. All right, let's see. I probably have everything is never, I have to zip through all that clouds. You have a little preview. And you know, anyone can see these afterwards. Come on, go. Oh, come on, why are you stopping here? Sorry, this is not the prettiest way of doing it, but it doesn't want to stop where I want to stop it.
And for those out there who really want to hear about Decay, I'm sure if we stick around later.
Stay around, I'll put it on there. Okay. All right, I'm going to move this poll off. So rain and flooding is very close to my heart because it's something that that is right in front of us. It is the piece of climate change that's going to affect all of us. A lot of artists talk about sea level rise, very important, but that's happening on the coast. Everywhere else where it rains, it's going to rain more and it's going to rain harder, and we're going to get a lot more flooding, particularly since we've covered up the earth. So come on, why aren't we here? Let me just see. So this is this beautiful map, and I forget who did this map, of all of the rivers and some of the smaller creeks or larger creeks that are running across America. And you can see this thing looks just like an organ of some sort. It's like you really see how the waterways are like capillaries that are draining this landform and getting all of that rain down into the oceans. And I love that the country, that the land looks just like we look inside too. And it's the same dendritic system that carries everything. Unfortunately, in building our cities and trying to keep our feet dry, we have paved over almost all the surfaces where the rain used to come trickling through. And you can, this is a wonderful painting by Caillebotte of Paris. You know, there's not a sprig of nature in there. It's all hard stuff. So that basically, I swear, we pave our cities to keep our feet dry, and our cars or vehicles and horse-driven carriages, the wheels from getting stuck in the mud. On the other side, you can see an old map of Philadelphia. And if you look carefully at it, you can see there used to be tons and tons of streams in that kind of pocket that's between the Schuylkill and the Delaware. And now there's nary a waterway. It is dry except for the Tinicum Marsh. All of those waterways went underground in pipes. And if you think about it, this is Brooklyn. Entire watersheds are running under our cities, and they're still running there. They're running sometimes in the sewer pipes, and sometimes they're breaking loose. And certainly during Hurricane Sandy, when Brooklyn really flooded, most of those floods followed the lines of the tributaries. So basically each stream was flooding and taking that street that was covering up the stream with it. It was rising up through the street. So you can really map the old watershed of Brooklyn when you look at Sandy flooding photos. So we've just been building these areas that we are all about our space, human space. We want to park, we want to build our houses, we want to do things that we want to do, and we rarely think about what nature needs to do. We think that everything belongs to us. So we need to think about, where is rain going to go in our cities? We're going to get so much more rain. Where are we going to put it? Where is it going to put itself? What are we going to build to support that system? And there is the rainfall is really increasing. This year was a strange dry year, but that'll probably be the last one for a while. And our climate crisis on the East Coast is going to be just these massive dumping rainstorms. And it's going to affect all of our cities and towns, no matter how close you are to a coastline. So learning to live with the rain, learning to enjoy it and to find something in it for us is very important to me. I think as an artist, that's one of the missions that I have, is to reintroduce rain as something wonderful, because there's going to be a lot of it, so you might as well get used to it. So the first thing is, you need to gain a sense of how the water runs through our cities, a sense of the passage of the historic streams under our streets, what their names were, how they flowed, that you can still hear them when you put your ear to a manhole cover. You can still hear many of those streams flowing. So they're very present, but we don't think about them. Because I feel like if you don't have any idea about where the rain goes, you're just not going to think about what to do with the rain. And you're not going to think about sharing your built space with the rain. And if you ignore it, you're just going to get into serious ostrich trouble that this pigeon seems to be in. So we need to really think about wetness in a different way. We need to understand that the landscape that surrounds us, the land that surrounds us, is sometimes wet and sometimes dry. It's not a perfect delineation of it's either wet or dry. It's either or. And our expectations of what should be dry, like this road should be dry so I can drive through it, that's gone. That is over with climate crisis. Everything's going to get a lot wetter, and all the stuff that we thought was going to be dry is not going to remain that way. Anur Mathur and Dilip thought about this sort of wetness gradient a great deal, and this idea of delineating water, and the thin blue line or the blue lake that's drawn on the USGS map is just not our reality. Water is seeping and soaking, bleeding, crossing borders and blurring the edges of systems and shapes. That's how we have to think about it. Water is more about time, the time it takes to be wet, not its wetness. So this new system that we need to embrace is sogginess. We have to understand that the world will be soggy a lot of the time, and we need to really embrace that state of sogginess. And it's going to require some very different thinking about how we live with rain. And one of the things that I think is, think that rain is the client, not humans. Rain is the client, and you always need to know what your client needs, because that's who you're working for. So one of the things we need to do is to give rain more of what it needs. And what it needs is, it needs time and space in order to infiltrate into our surfaces. In this ephemeral pond on the right, that's easy enough. But what happens in parking lots that are completely clad over with impervious surfaces like asphalt and concrete? How do we give rain some space in a parking lot? Because typically engineers have said, oh, we'll just get the rain out of there. We'll just take it off your hands and get that rain right out of your city and dump it into the nearest waterway. And it doesn't allow rain to soak in where it falls. And this has become a huge problem, because you end up with downstream flooding. So that lack of time and that lack of space that engineers have withdrawn from the rain is a real problem. So we need this to allow rain to breathe in and out. So it needs space. It's going to exhale when it's flooding, and then it will inhale and constrict in dry times. So you have to think of the water and all our waterways as breathing apparatuses. So soaking in and the time to soak in and the space to spread out is what we should aim for. And you can think about this in terms of your lawns and in terms of your parking lots. And in terms of urban parks, all of these places need to do more of this, giving rain time to soak in and giving rain time to spread out, not rushing it. And these kind of ephemeral ponds can happen right in the middle of the city. This is Pier 53, right on the Delaware and Washington Avenue Green, where an entire rain garden was basically cut into the surface, the hard surface of the parking lot. And it's not an answer like this. This is the engineered culverts, which said there's going to be this much rain, so we need this big a diameter of pipe. And these things are not flexible systems. They don't expand to hold more rain or contract when they're not needed. So that old way of engineering isn't going to work for the new rain. So we just have to realize that our landscape around us is going to be very changed by storms, and we have to design to be able to live with that. This is a project called Bushkill Curtain, which just shows you how high the Bushkill Creek is after storms. And one of the things is taking the rain from the roof to a place where it can spend some time is something that artists can be very involved in, so that you can sort of celebrate this wet transit. This is a project at the Frick Environmental Center where all the rain from the roof is poured into this runnel and then goes down into treatment wetlands. And that's another view. You can see it coming off the roof, coming down the weir, and then going through this sort of topographical mini terrace, which is also great when it's dry and you can hang out in and play in. So creating these spaces that are both good in the wet and the dry is something that artists can have an ear to and really work on. I'm also really intrigued by the idea of drawing with vegetation. Remember, I was talking about the sycamores being like ghost maps of the streams. Well, other vegetation like red-stemmed dogwood is also doing it. It shows the presence of a creek. I will look at this and being able to read the landscape, I know that a creek is flowing underneath those red stems. And I always love the fact that it's red stems, not blue stems. So, because we often depict water as blue, but here it is a red line in the landscape showing us this wet area. So that's important. This is the Garden of Dendritic Decay at Pier 53. It's just simply cut into the asphalt. Asphalt cuts like butter if you have a saw. It's really quite impressive. Much easier to cut than concrete. So we're sharing the parking lot. You know, instead of us taking the lion's share of all the built environment, it's high time that we share it more equitably with nature, and also in ways that allow the rain to move through. And if there's a huge meeting at the Union Hall, they can actually park over this tributary sort of gravy board that's cut into the parking lot. So this kind of, I think of this project as making urban streams in parking lots so that we can have these ephemeral streams occurring in our own driveways and certainly in the Michener parking lot, if you'd like me to design it. So the other thing is the creeks need to be treated in a different way because the streams need to flow, but they shouldn't flow with these bare shoulders that you can see here. And this is a project where the art is trying to show where the stream needs to go. This is a full-scale planting plan of what this stream should be planted with in order to create a stream bank buffer zone, that the roots of these plants, which would be in here, would hold the soil and shade the river, shade the stream that's here, and sort of hold the whole system together even when it floods. So you need to have vegetation on your side helping to hold the tributary system. There it is. So being aware that these are living spaces and need to have more diversity. Each of these sticks is a different color. There were 4 different plants that were to be planted here. I think it's been planted. This is what happens with these projects where they had to wait an extra year, but I believe it's been planted, though I don't have any pictures of that. But you basically could pull out a stick and you'd say, orange, that's for elderberry. Blue is for aronia. Oh, this is for pink is for viburnum. So it was like a quick and easy way to get a diverse group of shrubs to create a buffer along the stream bank. And Rainyard was at the Schuylkill Center in Philadelphia, Northwest Philadelphia. And this is also a new way to live with rain, a sort of little artist's experiment of another way to live with rain. One of the things is creating this bunk bed approach where there's a place for people and a place for water. There always has been that. Water used to get the pipe and people got everything else. Now we're going to flip that over on its head. And instead of water getting the tiny pipe, people get the smaller place, but it's fun and intriguing. So people don't care. They don't need 40 acres of parking lot, but the water gets the lion's share. And so what happens is this is permeable sort of mesh surface. The rain goes down through the mesh. The plants poke up through the mesh and the people stay off the soggy soil and don't compact the roots and their feet stay dry. So it's a win-win. And so it's like, it's less room for people, but it's a more fun kind of space, more intriguing space, and much more room for the rain. And a real place to celebrate wetness, because I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time playing around with gutters when I was in elementary school, and whenever it rained, I would stand under gutters and just celebrate all this crazy amount of water coming out of the sky. And we sort of lose that somewhere along our development into adulthood. And I think we should bring that back, that celebration of the wet. And it's very important to be able to work in every season, as you saw at the Frick, working wet and dry, but also working with the other kinds of precipitation like snow and ice, so that these things have to be built very robustly so that they can manage whatever nature throws at them. So more ways of celebrating rain and remembering that flooding is going to be part of our landscape. It has for a while. This is from 1815, a flood marker. And we're going to have more. This is the project that's at the Michener, Slow Tide. And I'm very interested in giving this very kind of visceral sense of how far the floodwaters expand, not just thinking, oh, I should check that FEMA map to see where the flood's going to be, but getting a real sense of, will my neighborhood be under the water when it floods? And so I'm studying the flood maps of the Delaware. And then I'm mapping the Delaware. So Delaware with the white caps, the strand with the white caps is the river at normal level, and it's filled with river water. And then the flood stage are filled right now with empty bottles because they were waiting for the flood. Now, the Delaware didn't flood this year, which is unusual because every other project I do on rivers, I've had terrible flooding. So I really expected to be out there at least twice to collect flood water, but it didn't flood this year because it was so droughty, but at least it shows the extent of the flooding. These bottles have remained empty. Otherwise, if it had flooded, I would have run out and filled the bottles with flood water. A little bit nasty, but you wash up afterwards, no worse than Corona. And so here I am collecting in my trusty buckets, collecting it. This is a normal flow and collecting at 3 different sites on the Delaware. And my trusty assistant, who happens to be my son this time because it was COVID, we were in a pod, we're bringing the water back to the gallery in carefully lidded and labeled too, the zones, and then filling each of the bottles up with river water. You can see the cart, we filled them in a place that didn't have a wood floor. So they've been carefully filled with funnels, and now they're being laid out with the vinyl saying Delaware River there, where it says Delaware. So that's live collected water. And it's interesting, when you have to go out and collect and carry all that water, it becomes very, very precious. It's sort of like a kind of holy water for environmentalists. But the river didn't flood this year, so these all stayed empty. But it still gives a very strong sense of how much that river breathes out, exhales, and how contained it is when it isn't flooding, with the white lids showing the passage of the river. And it is likely it's going to be doing this next year. This is Yardley and flood. It will probably flood next year. And unfortunately, I'll miss that. But so I just will end with saying that nature doesn't really care about us. It's not watching to see if we're going to make any changes, because nature really, we're just blips on nature's hide in a certain way. We're like barnacles. So we need to take responsibility to watch ourselves and to make sure that we make the changes so that we can live with the elements that are coming our way, one of which is rain. And that's it. So embrace the new soggy. All right,
Wow.
end of mini lecture. That might have gone on.
Yes, thank you, Stacy. Embrace the soggy. I love it. Here, let's. I'm going to stop your sharing
screen. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
good.
stop your sharing screen. We've got 2 more polls left for us tonight, and we're going to get right to those here. So, our next poll number 4 for us. I'm going to launch this poll. This is a story time. Which of these art adventures do you want to hear about next? You Can't Art There, Encounters with the Law, Whoops, my most unexpected art situations, and Wrath and Fury, Nature versus Art. All right, everyone, tell us what you want to hear about. In the meantime, Stacy, you talked about, the client. We have to make sure that rain is the client that we serve. I want to ask you, who are you working for as an artist who deals with the environment? Who is your client?
It's a very interesting question, and it's helped me be able to focus on the natural forces when in these very convoluted and difficult to permit larger projects. There are a lot of human needs and a lot of administrative requirements. So I have to stay pretty clearly focused on the fact that whatever aspect of nature I'm working on, that's the client. So it might be birds might be the client. Sometimes the tide is the client. And oftentimes it's things like taking care of the rainwater or trying to help a lake from being so polluted. The lake becomes the client. It's not that I ignore people. I'm very, very attentive to the people who are going to be using the space, to the communities that live around the space. So they're sort of like second client, but I have to go with the different species of critters that are going to be out there. They're my client.
Yeah. Do you have like a do no harm sort of in all these environmental projects that you leave out there?
No, but I should, right?
All right, here, I think you've had enough time to vote, and the results are, let's see here.
Oh, some people have been in the encounters too.
It's neck and neck, but they want to hear your close encounters with the law. It's my
encounters with the law, yes. And there have been a number of them, but which is sort of funny because you wouldn't expect that an artist would end up encountering the law, but there's always a certain amount of trespassing that I do when I collect water, though I have never been stopped for trespassing. All you have to do in order to trespass, this is a secret that I will pass on to you, wear rubber boots, a utility belt, and an orange day-glow vest, and have a clipboard, and you can go anywhere. Yeah. So, but only do good things. So I've never been stopped crossing private property. I often get stopped by police when I'm standing on a bridge with a rope and a bucket because it's a little odd looking, but I always try and have an invitation for my show with me so I can give it to the police. But I was doing a drawing on the ground, a chalk drawing on the ground on 64th Street, East 64th Street in Manhattan. And we're swirling these wonderful arcs of blue paint on the ground with little buckets of paint and small brushes. It's nothing too great, but it has a sort of Jackson Pollock quality. And all of the superintendents for the buildings are standing outside with their arms crossed in front of them, wondering what we're doing, which we're very, very happy to explain. But I think a couple of them got a little nervous that blue might get tromped into their lobbies. And so they decided they'd call the police. Fortunately, I had some idea what I was doing. I knew that you're allowed to draw on the sidewalk with chalk. Chalk is permissible. If I was painting and spray painting, I would be a graffitiist and I could be, God, put away forever in New York City. So I knew that I had the law on my side. So the cops all came, the superintendents came over to bring the cops to me, like, oh, that'll stop her. And the cops said, so what are you using? And I said, I'm using chalk. And they're like, that's fine, ma'am. And so the superintendents sort of went into a huff, but then we got to talking a little bit. And all the superintendents were talking about how they had to pump their basements out. They had never had that in other buildings that they had worked for. They were constantly pumping the basements out. And then somebody else piped in and said, oh yeah, this is known as the mosquito block because this block has the worst mosquitoes in Manhattan. And then we all put it together. There was a long puddle. It had been dry for 2 weeks and there was no reason there should be a puddle. We realized that we actually were drawing the historic DeVore's Mill Creek that was technically running under this road. I used historic map and overlaid it with modern day Google Maps to think that this is probably the tracing of the stream. And it turned out that it definitely was because the stream sort of proved itself by seeping up and creating these puddles that never dried out, which were fabulous mosquito habitat and also seeped into the basements of all the buildings. So that's why East 64th Street is so wet because DeVore's Mill Creek is running right down the middle of it.
I love how you resolved that situation. I'm glad that it had a
It had worse.
non-incarceration solution
yet.
there. All right, last poll for us tonight, everyone. The big finish, poll number 5. What type of question do you want Stacy to answer last? Do you want to hear we have a very specific questions for both of these, but do you want to hear a big, deep philosophical question or a fun introspective question? While we're waiting for that to cook, let's see here. Stacy, in an alternate universe where you chose a different profession, what do you think that would have been and why?
A different profession. Well, I mean, I think I always thought doesn't everyone think they want to be a marine biologist because so they could, study porpoises? So originally I thought that that's something I really wanted to do. But I realized that as I saw what grad school was like, that you had to sort of go down a very narrow hole in your studies. And I wouldn't be studying porpoises or seals. I'd be studying the third spot of aperture in a sponge or something. I decided that I wanted to remain broader in my ability to investigate things. And that's one of the great advantages of art is you can study all sorts of things while you're doing your work. And so if I want to find out more about diatoms, which became a very interesting set of living species, they're microalgae that are floating in every waterway from puddles to oceans. And they're just dynamically gorgeous architecture. I could study that and find out about them. I didn't have to give myself over to the decade study of a particular thing. So being an artist allowed me to be a generalist. And even though my mother used to threaten me with a jack of all trades and master to none as a bad thing, I have become a jack of all trades.
Yeah, I can see how your work definitely touches on so many different sort of professions and careers and skill sets that you have to exposure to a lot of those. All right, the results are in. Let's see here. It looks like, every time we've done this, everyone always, I'm like, come on, let's hear the big feel. No, they always want to hear the fun introspective question. And here it is. If you could spend the day living with one animal, any animal, what would it be and why?
I would live with a beaver. Beavers, in terms of beavers are the landscape architects of the natural world, and they have done more to change the landscape. The American landscape was entirely different looking when the white settlers first came. It was much wetter. the beavers are fans of soggy. They like a kind of half wet area, and they make that for themselves. So I think in terms of embracing rain, I would learn a lot from beavers to study the sogginess that they create with their dams. So they're really important for making habitat for other species beside themselves while they're satisfying their own needs. And I think that kind of collaborative, where everyone's working what they need, is definitely a symbolic activity of the beavers. They're very collaborative. So I would definitely hang out with the beavers for a day. Also, I would love to swim into my house every time I want to enter my front door.
I love that answer. Beavers. Oh, that's so great. Oh, so we've come to the end of our choose your own adventure. We do have a few questions that have been popped up here in the chat, and I want to bring these to you. Phoebe says that her brother experiences a king tide in Florida. Do you have any idea what a king tide is or how it functions?
Yeah, I have a little bit of an idea. I used to sort of know more about king tides, but I've kind of lost exactly what happens. Tides are not as regular as we think they are. And in fact, when you read books about tides, it's amazing how little science there is about them. We can predict most tides quite a ways into the future, but there are a lot of things that people don't quite understand, like why is one tide 6 inches higher when you go 30 miles up the coast and then it drops back down. So there are these nuances about tides that you can't always tell. And I noticed when I was working in the Schuylkill that there were parts of the tide, I sort of smoothed over this idea that that the Schuylkill would drop down a foot an hour. Sometimes it would drop faster than that in the hour, and sometimes it would drop a little slower than that. So there's a lot of variation. King tides happen because of, they definitely happen on the which moon? The new and the full, when the celestial bodies of the sun and the moon are aligned and collaborating, working together. So they have a bigger tidal bulge, which is making the high tide. That's very important. So that has a king tide. But why these weird tides sometimes come up? In New York during Sandy, there was a quote king tide, which was a particularly high tide because of the moon, but also there's something called a flood tide when there's a lot of extra water being dropped into the sea. It's coming down from the rivers, and it's just creating much more water going in and coming towards the coast. So you can get a sort of flood / king tide that way. But why these kind of mysterious extra high tides happen, though they do always happen on the new and full moons, is something like a rogue wave. There's just something that pushes, like why one wave is so much bigger than another. It's some kind of perfect storm of situations, and you will get a king tide, and they can be quite substantial and very, very floody.
I want to let people know that we are recording this event, and if you want to view it later or show someone who couldn't make it tonight, this will be up on our YouTube page, the Michener's YouTube page, sometime in the next few weeks. A couple more questions here. One more. Where did it go? Andrea wants to know about your cool home behind you. Did you design your home, or where are you right now?
I'm in central Pennsylvania. I just had knee surgery. I just had my knee replaced. So I'm very, very homebound. So thank God for Zoom. And this is my living room, and it's built exactly, built exactly like a barn. In fact, there's a ladder right behind me here, which is part of the situation. It's a timber frame situation, and the walls were built and people stood and raised the walls up from the flat ground in order to make this box that we live in. And it's been a nice place to live. Central Pennsylvania is very cloudy. And so a lot of the houses, the old farmhouses, have very small windows. And we had enough of that after our first couple of years here, because it's dark as can be in a winter's afternoon. So this place has a lot of windows, which makes a big difference. But it is a barn structure. It's a timber structure, just like a bank barn, only
Fantastic.
no cattle inside.
Last question here from Eleanor. You've talked about how lousy lawns are for rain collection. Why do you think people are so hooked on having lawns?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. The love of lawn runs so deep, particularly in America. In America, there was a distrust of fences and walls in our communities. And if you see a British town, everyone has a walled-in yard. And then you drive past this sort of economic equivalent to an American town, and there's nary a wall to be found. No one has a walled-in space. It's grass just segueing to the next lawn and the next lawn. It's almost like one continuous shared wall-to-wall carpet of grass. What makes that happen? I think there was a wariness in America about walls, and that if you couldn't see in, you didn't know what was happening inside. So there was this feeling that if the entire yard was clear to be seen from the street, then there were no mysteries and no strangeness. And that made people feel calmer. Of course, no one comes out in their front yards. If you're ever in suburbia, you will, if you had one of those bingo cards that said someone walking out of their front lawn in suburbia, you'll never open that door, because no one uses their front yards. They're filled with lawns. They just mow them and then just leave them. Why do people love lawn? In America, the grass structure is a warm season grass. Our grasses are sort of brownish until the summer, and then they green up, and then they turn brown again in the winter. In England and most of Britain and great chunks of Europe, they're cool season grasses. And it means that they're green in the cool seasons, i.e. in the winter. So you have this beautiful greenness in England, whereas in America, in like the prairies and the grasslands, it was all sere and brown. And so I think people desired that greenness of the English lawn during the winter. They were hungry for it. And so basically replaced the natural grasses and the natural goldenrod fields and aster fields with these shorter grasses that made them feel that spring was more eternal and that they were more at home in a kind of Britishized landscape. So that is our love of lawn. It reminds us of the old country.
I love that answer. All right, so we are at 7:09 right now. I'm still getting urges, calls to hear about things that decay. Would you indulge us, Stacy?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Perfect. So anyone out there, feel free to depart right now. Thank you for attending tonight. But if you are interested in hearing about things that decay, Stacy will indulge us and lead us through this part of your presentation. While Stacy's pulling this up, I want to remind everyone that you still have time. The Michener Art Museum is still open with time tickets. The show, Rising Tides, is up through the end of the year, so you do have a little bit of time to come and check it out. And lastly, if you enjoyed today's program, I highly encourage you to tell your friends, tell your families. Spreading the word is the best way for us to increase awareness for these programs.
Matt, are you seeing anything on my screen?
No.
Okay, I might have to share screen again. Let me escape this. Okay, I'm gonna hit share screen and see what happens. Okay, here we go. Let's hit that. Okay, now, because I can't see what you're seeing.
We can see it now. Perfect.
See what I see. So do you see, is there decay? Is there decay there?
Yep.
Okay,
yep.
Great. All right, so, and anyone who wants to leave in the middle of decay, just remember, it'll chase you around, hot on your trail. Decay is hot on all of our trails. Let me just, so I want to do view as a slideshow. So I'm particularly into things that decay. I really kind of love all the stuff that decays. And I'm always collecting images of decay that's happening. It's like here, the algae is taking over this awning in Rhode Island. And it's like, wow, that's just amazing. And there's, decay is a sort of interesting, it's a sort of wide a wide word in a certain way, but here's the typical algae that's in a lot of urban ponds and urban lakes. That's fairly yucky in a certain way. You don't really want to swim in it, but it's also absolutely chock-a-block with life, like slimy frog's eggs. These are some stones that I carved for the Schuylkill Center. And these are rotifers, which are eating the algae, eating the green stuff. And duckweed, which is a very beautiful green, but a little scary when you get up close. So I'm always looking at what is in the water, what's decaying, what's eating what, and is a sandblasted tube of what's swimming in the water with the water sample behind it. I love the fact that water is a magnifier of things, almost like you're having this microscope. And decay can be beautiful if you kind of get into it. And I found myself really, really loving it because I looked at what that's on this Lemonis penicillium in the greenish celadon green part. And it's like, oh, that looks sort of awful because we know that lemon has gone bad. But if you look at penicillium under a microscope, it's really extraordinary microfloral. And I did this as for the flower show. There was a concurrent show on alternative gardens, and I looked in the microscope to see what mold looked like and created these mold garden projects because the patterns are beautiful. So what's gross is also beautiful. This is Aspergillus mold, and this is the Aspergillus pattern. I mean, that's like a goldenrod. It's just it's a beautiful pattern. It's something that decays things, but what a floral pattern it is. Flowers all the way down. And this is this wonderful Kathleen Ryan who does these just fabulous giant fruits that are decaying, and they're all made out of precious stones and beads, which I really like. I was quite into this. And I'd like to buy one of these one day. So, but this idea that of kind of embracing mold. I mean, now for a while, if the bread was moldy, I used to think that's really yucky. And I remember my kids when they were in the house and I was making mold garden and talking about how beautiful these microflorals were. It started to be that people would bring me oranges or grapefruits that had big blotches of Aspergillus or penicillium growing on and go, look, Mom, this is so cool. So changing yucky to cool is something I think artists are good at. And sort of this idea of decay, long time has been part of art making. The Dutch painters were always painting these vanitas, which was all, I learned about that they were symbolic of life is fleeting. But since I've also learned that it's a very consumerist thing, like, hey, we can afford a lobster and beautiful glass, and we happen to have a lemon or a grapefruit, and you don't have that. So these were also very much about consumption and having very fancy things. My modern vanitas, I did a project in which I was at Snug Harbor, and I took the curator's lunch every day, went into one of these boxes that were filled with worms. So I was doing vermiculture. So the curator's lunch would go in there and get eaten up, and the worms would reprocess lunch into compost. So, and if we didn't have decay, oh my God, the world would be like, it would be very filled with crap. It'd be a real problem. We wouldn't be able to get around. So this sort of process of decay is absolutely essential for us to be moving through the world. And it's also gorgeous at the same time. Look at this fungi. It's like Japanese lanterns. They're so beautiful. These are growing typical sort of white spore creating blossoms on sodden wood, wet wood. And this is Bonnie Ora, wonderful artist. And this is like coming to grips with the fact that our man-made materials don't really decay. Our stuff doesn't decay like nature decays. Nature's a fast recycler, and we are not. And it makes me think about art. I don't know where this, but sometimes it's like this idea that art should also have a decay process to it also. It does not have to last so long all the time. But I also employ other forms of decay, and one of them is a sort of a sped up erosion, which is sandblasting. So I was going to show you a little about how I decay the top surfaces so that I can get a pattern out. And so I'm blasting away, sort of like a cameo, to show the other color or surface underneath that original one. This is in San Antonio. It's a huge carpet of hydrological patterns that connects the river, the San Antonio River, which this woman is walking towards, to the Mission, which is just on the other side of us. And so that's a kind of decay that goes on. And so sandblasting is a really great way of drawing for the outside, though it will fade with time, it will decay also. It gives you this way of having a lasting way of making a mark on hard surfaces. And there's the whole project from above. Thank God for drones. And harnessing this process of decay is really interesting to me. I've always looked at parking lots that were trying to go back to nature when they were being, the grasses and forbs were coming into all the cracks. And I'm so interested that we often, if you're maintaining a parking lot, you look at grasses and plants coming into your parking lot as a form of decay. But it's funny to think, I think of the grasses as a wonderful thing. Wouldn't we rather have more grasses than concrete? But if you're needing to keep that concrete going, you don't want anything making a fissure in your concrete, because the moisture gets in and then it freezes and thaws and breaks apart. So I'm really interested in this idea of how we can get a certain amount of plant life in the concrete. And that's, you saw this earlier on one of the other shows. So it's all about creating a new way to bring plants into a hardscape. And there it is, 3 growing seasons later, doing pretty well. And I've done a number of projects that with planting things. Sometimes the planting is permanent and sometimes it's temporary. And so in this case, it's Straw Garden, which is in Seattle, right under the Space Needle. And you could look down on it. It was based on Baroque parterres, but made with absolutely modern materials, which are these wattles. So they have a very old English name. They are coconut coir and straw that's in nets. And they're used in construction to kind of block water from flowing from one place to the other when there's no cover on the soil. So in big construction sites, in road constructions, you'll always see these wattles being used as a kind of plug to stop the water from running off and eroding the landscape. I planted these with native species, and laid them out. And then they were, at the end of the show, in about a year, these pieces were chopped up and taken to individual gardens in other parts of Seattle, in woodland gardens, and also in pea patches, which are like community gardens that needed these other plants and perennial seed sources. So it was sort of like having a perennial plant shop laid out under the Space Needle, and then they all got adopted. And the last trace of them was this muddy drawing that they left, which I really loved, which was sort of, the lawn had been decayed by the presence of the wattles on top, but that pattern lived on for a while. Of course, I had to plant grass on it, but it was cool for about a week. And other things are in a state of decay because of how we're living with them, like our waterways. I'm always looking at old maps to see what was and is no longer. And things like the Decay Channel. This is the Delaware and League Island. That's, if you look at the 1903, that's League Island, which you also saw a picture of before with that engraving. And you can see that League Island was an actual island. And then they cut that channel off, where you can see the blue arrow with the yellow outline. They've cut that channel away because they wanted the land, and they wanted it for an airport, a military airport, and then just to create a bigger sort of wet dock for the Navy. And so, whoops, sorry. Oh, sorry. So you can see in this bottom overlay how the river, the pattern of the river has decayed in order for development of the city of Philadelphia to happen. It didn't have to go that way, but it did go that way. So the decay of the watershed in the city, the fact that there used to be all these marshlands. There's League Island, you can see at the very bottom of this map. with quite a substantial channel, and Hollander's Creek and Hell Creek and all these other creeks that used to carry the rain from the wetlands into the river have all been paved over, dried up, and basically a kind of reverse decay. They've been taken away, but the system has been decayed by their diminishment. There's so many less waterways in Philadelphia in the modern era. So you can see the light blue on the left is historic waterways, quite a dendritic pattern, very much that capillary pattern that we looked at. That looks like a healthy liver, say. And then you look at the current waterways, it's like a necrotic liver. There's all these spaces where there's no flow going across it. And that's basically where the city of Philadelphia is, where you see those blank areas. That's the city. It's covered up all the streams. So the watershed has been decayed in many of our older cities, in all of our cities. Nobody keeps the streams. They kick them out. And so that system is decayed. And there's another kind of decay that goes on in cities. This is something that requires a karst landscape, a limestone landscape, which gets eaten away by underground streams, like a kind of Swiss cheese, and then all of a sudden falls in because something hefty like a bus rolls over it. So here is a bus that has just fallen into a sinkhole because of the decayed subsurface geology. And my daughter sent me this very funny thing. You know, Pittsburgh has all these inclines, and then they added the bus incline in with that. So I thought that was very cute. So that's the end of decay as we know it.
Thank you so much, Stacy. That was really fantastic. I want to thank everyone who has joined us tonight. I really appreciate it. We did have one question, Stacy. Where can people find out about your work? I put your website there.
My website is probably the best bet, which is stacy@stacylevy.com. That is Levy, even though it's pronounced Levy. So it's Stacy with no E. So stacy@stacylevy.com. I could throw it in the chat too.
Yeah, I put it in there, and I think that's the perfect place for people.
Yeah, that's a good place to find things.
Perfect. Well, again, I want to thank everyone who came tonight. Thank you. And most of all, thank you, Stacy, for sharing your beautiful work.
That was great. Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. And it was really fun to do, Matt. This was a complete, like a roller coaster of a talk. I just didn't know where it was headed.
Very fun, very exciting. Thank you for being such a good sport, Stacy. All right, everyone. We'll see you later. Be safe.
Good night. Thanks so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. Bye-bye now.